Somebody once asked me how many Bibles I actually own, and the truth is, I lost track after about the first 75. And chances are, you might also have multiple copies of the Bible at your house, even if you're not all that religious. Yet sometimes, easy access can make us forget just how difficult it was to get an English Bible produced in the first place. That's on today's episode of Authentic. My barbarian ancestors started to adopt the Christian faith right around the time of Charlemagne, which makes good sense because Charlemagne and the Franks kind of thought of themselves as the military force of the Bishop of Rome. They kept themselves busy pushing their way northward in order to annex new territories, but at the same time, they wanted to bring those hopeless Germanic heathens into the fold of the church. It's a deeply fascinating story, and wouldn't you know it, my own tribe was one of the more stubborn holdouts. In time, we did become Christian, and when we did, we came into a situation where the Scriptures were not available in the common tongue of the people. The official organized church was deathly afraid that if uneducated people like us read the Bible for themselves, they might, through their ignorance, become heretics and break away from the establishment. So they figured that translating the Bible into a vulgar language was frankly dangerous. Now, when you see the word vulgar used in an academic sense, it's not talking about rude behavior or dirty jokes. The word simply means common. You and I use vulgar to describe crass behavior because once upon a time the upper crust of society thought that rude behavior was something you could expect from the commoners, the lower classes. Unrefined language was thought of as common or vulgar, and over time we started using the word vulgar to describe naughty words. But originally, it just meant common, which is why Jerome's 4th century Latin translation of the Bible is called the Latin Vulgate. It was a Bible translated into the common language of the Roman Empire, which of course was Latin. Naturally, Jerome has been rightly praised for his achievement, but as the church moved forward into the medieval period, it developed a fear of letting everybody just read the Scriptures for themselves. It was far better, they thought, for church-appointed experts to handle the matter of biblical interpretation. That way, you could control the religious impulses of fanatics. The problem with that approach, of course, was the fact that the magisterium, the teaching authority of the church, became incredibly insular, without external checks and balances to keep it honest about what the Bible said. By the time you get to Wycliffe's day, the church was already notorious for its noticeable theological problems, and unfortunately, the atrocious behavior of the clergy. When Martin Luther made his famous pilgrimage to Rome, he expected to find a very high level of piety, but what he found was a lot of drunkenness and debauchery. When the earliest reformers like Wycliffe and Tyndale began to push back and started translating the Bible into English, the church blew a gasket. Wycliffe died before they could actually get their hands on him, but they declared him to be a heretic anyway. They dug up his body in 1428, burned it, and threw the ashes into the Thames River. After all, a man who made the Bible available to everybody must not be allowed to rest in the hallowed ground of a church cemetery. To the amusement of some historians, there's actually a chance they dug up the person next to Wycliffe by mistake, which immediately highlights the absurdity of thinking that the church had the ability to compromise your salvation by removing you from your grave. I mean, what if the guy they actually dug up was a good and faithful church member? Would he be lost now? In the famous words of Sebastian Castellio, an early reformer who preached about the importance of religious liberty, to kill a man is not to defend a doctrine, it is to kill a man. Of course, they didn't actually kill Wycliffe, but the principle still applies. Desecrating his body doesn't do a thing to change his status with God. Tyndale, of course, was less fortunate. They really did kill him by strangling him and then burning his body at the stake. It was a really high price to pay for personal convictions. Those who were there tell us that when Tyndale was a student, he one day told his teacher, "If God spare my life, ere many years I will cause a boy that driveth the plow should know more of the Scripture than thou dost." As he breathed his last, Tyndale uttered a prayer that many people consider to be prophetic. He said, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And within 3 years, his prayer appears to have been answered. At the end of 1534, the Synod of Canterbury, led by Thomas Cranmer, petitioned Henry VIII to decree that the Holy Scriptures shall be translated into the vulgar English tongue by certain upright and learned men to be named by the said most illustrious king. Henry VIII, who had broken away from the Bishop of Rome and established his own English church, really liked this idea. So he commissioned a guy by the name of Miles Coverdale to produce a Bible. Coverdale took Tyndale's unfinished work, revised it, and finished it using Jerome's Latin Vulgate as a reference for the parts that Tyndale had not been able to complete. Now that was a little ironic because one of William Tyndale's greatest achievements was to abandon the Vulgate and translate the scriptures from the original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. But of course, Coverdale wasn't really the scholar that Tyndale was, and he had to do what he could to get the job done. He also used Luther's Bible and a few other manuscripts. The first edition of the Coverdale Bible was released in 1535. Now, some people started calling that the chained Bible because it was usually chained to the wall. Today you'll hear some people saying that the Bibles were chained to the wall to keep common folk from reading them, but that's not really the reason they did it. I mean, yes, the Bible was being kept away from regular folks, but that was done by keeping it locked up in a foreign language. The real reason they chained Bibles to the wall was the same reason the bank used to chain a ballpoint pen to the counter, to keep you from stealing it. Bibles and pretty much all books were really, really expensive, even after the inventing of the printing press. A couple of years later, in 1537, there was another English Bible, the work of a man who went by the pseudonym Thomas Matthew. Historically, we think he was actually John Rogers, one of Tyndale's friends, who was later executed by the infamous Bloody Mary. So, now we had two officially sanctioned English translations of the Scriptures. But neither of these Bibles proved to be satisfactory because, one, Coverdale's Bible had not been entirely translated from the original languages, and two, the Matthew Bible had marginal notes and an introduction that said some rather unflattering things about the authorities. But all that aside, it was a triumph for the world of English-speaking Christianity. But then Queen Mary, affectionately known as Bloody Mary, came to the throne in 1553, and English Protestants suddenly found themselves in a really perilous place. Up to 1,000 leading Protestant thinkers packed up and left the British Isles for the European mainland, with most of them going to either Germany or Switzerland. It was during that time that John Foxe wrote Foxe's Book of Martyrs while living in exile in the city of Basel. In October 1554, a group of these exiles organized an English-speaking church in Geneva, with the illustrious John Knox as their pastor. Of course, Geneva was home to John Calvin and the center of his Protestant movement, so it was a really comfortable place for English Christians who had a Calvinist bent. But I'll tell you what isn't comfortable. The fact that the clock says it's time for me to take a break. So I'm going to have to do that, and I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
Geneva was a key center for the Protestant movement in the middle of the 16th century. It was also a center for textual scholarship, producing a number of new Bible translations in everyday languages. Geneva produced Bibles in Italian, Spanish, and French, and as you might expect from a group of English exiles, it also gave us a brand new English translation, the Geneva Bible, which came out in 1560. There's a deeply moving preface in this translation that spells out the motivation for creating this book. It is addressed to, quote, our beloved in the Lord, the brethren of England, Scotland, Ireland, etc. And after it explains that Christians should be living in both the fear and the love of God, it says this: "For as much as this thing chiefly is attained by the knowledge and practicing of the Word of God, which is the light to our paths, the key of the kingdom of heaven, our comfort in affliction, our shield and sword against Satan, the school of all wisdom, the glass wherein we behold God's face, the testimony of His favor, and the only food and nourishment of our souls, we thought that we could bestow our labors and study in nothing which could be more acceptable to God and comfortable church than in the translation of the Holy Scriptures into our native tongue." Today, Christians might read that and say, well, of course, because we've become so used to reading the Bible for ourselves. If you don't understand the historical context, that could be the introduction to any number of modern Bible translations. But again, you've got to remember that the people who wrote this were starting a revolution. They were willing to risk their lives to be sure that you and I have access to the Bible in a language that we actually understand. Prior to the 16th century, only the highly educated could actually read the Scriptures, because if you didn't know Latin or Hebrew or Greek, you were just out of luck. I guess it's like a lot of other things. Today, you and I take for granted that regular people should have a say when it comes to government, but in medieval Europe, that was hardly true. We easily forget that our God-given rights were not always available to us, and it's easy from the distance of nearly 500 years to lose sight of just how monumental an English translation of the Bible really was. The fact that it had to be published in exile is an important reminder that, historically speaking, our present liberties are an anomaly. And no matter how secure our freedoms seem to be right now at this moment, no matter how comfortable we've become, we are never more than one bad idea away from losing it all. In fact, one of the key themes you'll find in the pages of Bible prophecy is a prediction that the tide will eventually turn against intellectual and religious freedom. It's one of the reasons I'm concerned about what some people are calling cancel culture. I'm hardly alone with my concern. In fact, I'm starting to get some strange company on that front, including the likes of Bill Maher. I'm talking about this inclination we're developing to silence people we disagree with. I know that some people don't believe it's actually happening, and on the other side of the coin, other people exaggerate how often it does happen. But the tendency, especially on platforms like social media, it does bother me. Of course, social media platforms are privately owned. They're not publicly owned forums, and the owners have every right to control the content. I don't believe for a moment that the government should intervene and force the owners to host people and ideas they don't happen to agree with, because that would also be a violation of liberty. But all that aside, I still find it concerning that so many people, instead of wrestling with ideas and evaluating them carefully, just want uncomfortable opinions to go away. That's actually been the way it has been for most of recorded history, and we'd be foolish to forget how rare our current freedom actually is. And I know allowing everybody to speak means that people with bad ideas also get to speak. But in a broken world, that's the price you have to pay for your freedom. I'm quite happy to endure the stupid corners of the internet if it means that I'm also free to express what I want to say. Before we start silencing people, we really need to ask ourselves how long it would be before someone would want to silence us or make our beliefs illegal. It's almost like a secular version of the magisterium that's growing today, where a handful of self-proclaimed intellectuals reserve the right to tell the rest of us what we're allowed to say or believe. And sadly, if that attitude ends up winning the day, I fear that a secular magisterium might prove to be even more unpleasant than a religious one, now that we've apparently abandoned the idea of all objective morality. But enough about that. It's a bit of a sidebar. Let's get back to one of the most important developments in the history of English-speaking Christianity, the publication of the Geneva Bible. One of the most notable features of this important translation is the fact that it doesn't list the names of the people who did the work. For the most part, we've had to do a little bit of detective work to figure out who did this. Of course, their forerunners were persecuted or even put to death for doing the same thing. And given Queen Mary's appetite for violence, the anonymity kind of makes sense. Putting your name in the credits might actually become a matter of life and death. In fact, in the preface to this version of the Bible, the translators pointed out that the, quote, time was then most dangerous and the persecution sharp and furious. Of course, the problem resolved itself in 1558 because Queen Elizabeth suddenly came to the throne, and that made conditions far more favorable. And I guess there's another reason they might have chosen to stay anonymous. Maybe they were just humble, and they understood that no human being can actually take credit for this incredible book. Now, that's not to say that the translators deserve no credit. The work of translation isn't easy, especially when you're working with concepts from a distant time and culture. Sometimes there is no exact English equivalent for a word you find in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, and so you have to do your very best to convey the meaning to an audience who cannot read the original language. That's still true today. In my family's native language, there's this word. It's Dutch, gezellig, and there is no English equivalent. This is why it's helpful to consult translations in other modern languages to see if the people who did that work actually came up with a better way to express a difficult concept, and then you find an English equivalent for what they did. Of course, we also have the problem of textual variance, where you'll find minor, itty-bitty tiny differences between various ancient manuscripts. Now, fortunately, because we have so much manuscript evidence for the Bible, it's generally possible to figure out these itty-bitty differences by considering the weight of evidence across all the various ancient copies that we have access to. It might just be a typo after all, a copy mistake in one ancient manuscript, and the other manuscripts will help you catch it. The Geneva Bible provided a number of important features, some of which you and I now take for granted. First of all, it was compact, or considered compact, which made it ideal for personal Bible study. This was portable. It also divided the text into verses, which made it easier to look things up, so that you and I could tell somebody where to find something in the pages of the Bible. Additionally, when the translators needed to use a word that wasn't in the original language to help make a passage clear, they printed that word in italics to let the reader know that it wasn't in the original, a feature that still appears in a lot of Bibles to this day. And of course, where the original meaning might be unclear to an English reader, they inserted marginal notes, another thing that Bible translators are still doing to this day. When it came to the names of people or places, they tried to stick as closely to the Hebrew or Greek as possible by simply transliterating them into English, spelling it out with the Latin alphabet so that it kind of sounds like the original. The Geneva Bible was physically beautiful, featuring 26 woodcut illustrations and 5 maps that would help the reader understand the geography of the Bible. There were brief introductions to each biblical book, designed to help the reader understand the reason the book was written. This was really one of the first English study Bibles, specifically designed to help lay people navigate what they were reading. And now I've got to navigate the clock on the wall, which means I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
When the Geneva Bible first hit the English marketplace, it was an overnight success. But there were some power brokers who really didn't like it because of the way that some of the marginal notes actually condemned the institution of the monarchy. For example, in Exodus 1 and verse 19, where the Hebrew midwives saved the lives of the male babies by defying Pharaoh, the Geneva Bible had a marginal note saying their disobedience in this was lawful, but their deception is evil. In other words, they were saying it was more important to obey God than a monarch. During the 1600s, The idea of a monarchy, or the divine right of kings, came under a great deal of scrutiny by the English dissenters, who'd been reading passages like 1 Samuel chapter 8, where God expresses his displeasure over Israel's decision to ask for a king. That became one of the biggest debates of the day, with luminaries like John Bunyan, Thomas Hobbes, and John Milton all jumping into the fray. So you can understand, in the beginning, the crown was not entirely favorable towards the Geneva Bible, and a lot of people continued to use the Great Bible or the Bishop's Bible instead. Geneva Bibles were mostly imported from Switzerland, which really hampered their circulation. But then in 1575, after the death of an archbishop who favored other translations, the Geneva Bible started to come off of English presses. Between 1575 and 1618, there was at least one new edition of the Geneva Bible every single year. In fact, between 1575 and 1611, the year King James came out, there were more than 120 editions of the Geneva Bible. And speaking of the King James Bible, the Geneva Bible was one of the key resources used to create that. In fact, when you read a Geneva Bible and a King James Bible side by side, you'll notice an awful lot of similarity. The scholar Charles C. Butterworth said this: "In the lineage of the King James Bible, the Geneva Bible is by all means the most important single volume. Only in the New Testament and the Pentateuch is its contribution overshadowed by the work of William Tyndale." You know, to really appreciate just how much the King James is indebted to the work of these Genevan scholars, let me read you a well-known passage from both translations. Now, if you happen to be watching this instead of listening to it on the radio or Spotify, you're going to miss the fact that I've retained the original spelling, but I'm guessing there aren't a lot of people who enjoy wading their way through the rather inconsistent spelling of medieval English. So here we go. John 3:16 and 17, one of our all-time favorites, this time from the Geneva Bible. It says, "For God so loved the world, that he hath given his only begotten Son, that whoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son into the world that he should condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." Now, remember, that was 1560. 51 years later, in 1611, we got the King James Bible, which is easily the longest-lasting and most popular English translation in history. Here's that same passage now in 1611. It says, "For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." You know, without the Geneva Bible, we probably wouldn't have the King James. Roughly 1 out of 5 passages in the King James was pretty much lifted out of the Geneva Bible, which is slightly more than the number of passages that were lifted from Tyndale's work. The Geneva Bible was so popular back in the day that the King James actually struggled to get a foothold in the hearts of the public. Initial sales were weak, and it didn't actually take off until King James himself banned the printing of the Geneva Bible. Even then, some of the translators who worked on the King James continued to preach from the Geneva Bible. That's how popular it was. You know, if it wasn't for the anti-monarchist marginal notes of the Geneva, we might not have gotten the King James. It was at a conference in 1604 that a Puritan suggested a new English translation, and some historians seem convinced, in addition to looking for something to unite a very polarized English public, it was the marginal notes that convinced James Stewart that a new Bible was a good idea. And here, in the United States of America, well, there's more than a passing chance that there was a copy of this Geneva Bible in the ill-fated Jamestown colony in 1607. And we know for sure there was a copy on the Mayflower when it arrived in Plymouth in 1620. The Puritans really liked this translation, and it was the favorite Bible of Christians living in both the Plymouth and Virginia colonies. I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
Of course, the question is, so what? Why does it matter that a bunch of exiles living in Geneva decided to translate the Bible into English? It's not like the English people didn't have access to other versions, because they did, ever since Henry VIII. And of course, hardly anybody still uses the Geneva Bible except for history buffs like me. So I spent half an hour talking about this. It's because it represents something really important, the astonishing preservation of the Scriptures. Somehow, with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the descent of Europe into the relative darkness of the medieval period, the Church itself lost sight of just how important the Bible is. Prior to the rise of the church-state alliance that appeared in the wake of Constantine, the Christian Scriptures in particular were being copied and distributed very freely. One of the reasons we have so many ancient New Testament manuscripts is because the early church let anybody who wanted to make a copy. That also meant that there were a lot of copy mistakes because many copies were made very quickly, as opposed to the work of Hebrew scholars who were very, very, very careful to make sure that their Old Testament copies were unbelievably accurate. Even under those conditions, there were still copy mistakes. But with Christianity, that problem kind of blossomed. Of course, if you have thousands and thousands of copies, it's really not all that hard to figure out what the original said because the mistakes become obvious. But now, the real point is this. The earliest church wanted the Word of God to be freely and widely distributed. They wanted you to have it. But then came the marriage of church and state, where the issues of power and control tragically became more important than the spread of the gospel. Back in Jerome's day, the Bible was made available in Latin, and it made good sense. That was the language of Rome. It was actually liberated by translating it into Latin. But then that very same feature kept my ancestors from reading the book, even after they joined the church, because the church insisted it had to stay in Latin. But there was no way it could ever stay that way. Here's what it says in Proverbs 4:18, and you know I'm going to use the Geneva. But the way of the righteous shineth as the light, that shineth more and more unto the perfect day. In other words, no matter how dark you and I try to make things, no matter how big a mess we make of this Christian faith, God has promised that He will restore the light, and that light will continue to spread and grow until Jesus returns. The Bible was restored to God's people against all odds, and when I read the stories of these people risking everything for it, some might call it a coincidence, but I see the hand of God pulling us closer and closer to the perfect consummation of history. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been Authentic. You want to help more people see Authentic for free? Like, comment, and subscribe, and share this episode. That tells the algorithm you really like the show, which in turn recommends Authentic to a lot more people. Thanks for your support.